Stanley Knowles, MP, guest tonight on Press Conference. Your chairman, Ottawa editor of the Claims magazine, Blair Fraser.
Good evening from Ottawa, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest on press conference this evening is Stanley Knowles, who is Member of Parliament from Winnipeg North Centre, J.S. Woodford's old seat. Mr. Knowles is the parliamentary whip of the CCF Cooperative Commonwealth Federation group in the House. And here to interview him is Bob McKeown of Weekend Magazine, Robert Needham of the London Free Press, and Norman Campbell of the Toronto Telegram. It's Norman Campbell who has the first question for Mr. Knowles.
Mr. Knowles, Mr. Bavan has been expelled from the British Labour Party parliamentary group for rejecting the Attlee leadership on German rearmament. You were recently spokesman for a CCF group who rejected the Coldwell leadership. Do you expect to continue as party whip?
Well, I don't think there's any comparison between the two situations at all, and I don't think you think that either. It's hardly my place to comment on what has happened in the United Kingdom. After all, that's an internal matter over there, except I might say that I think personalities were involved, and I think, too, that there was a pretty serious question of loyalty to a party decision, so far as Nye Bevan's position was concerned. In our case, while the matter was one of very serious import, which engaged our attention for a considerable time, we made a decision that so far as our group in the House is concerned, each man would vote the way he felt he should vote on the issue.
Well, Mr. Knowles, as I understand it, the party convention in Edmonton last summer decided that it would oppose German rearmament. Now then, how is it that Mr. Coldwell, the leader of the CPF, came out in favor of German rearmament since the party convention was opposed to it?
Well, it is a rather complicated question, but I'll try to deal with it as briefly as I can. What you have said about the party convention last summer at Edmonton is, in the view of some of us, substantially correct, but I draw your attention to the fact that that was prior to the London and Paris agreements. What was done at Edmonton was that the party took a decision against German rearmament in the light of facts as they stood at that time. Now, there's been no convention since then, so we did have a meeting of the National Council in January of this year, and that council discussed the whole question in the light of the NATO protocol, which was to come before Parliament, and the council reaffirmed the view of the convention. Most of us in the caucus took the view that the attitude as expressed by the convention meant that the movement would be against the NATO protocol as well. But there wasn't a firm decision by a convention against this specific proposal that was before Parliament, which meant that in the light of that situation, each of us had to make up our minds as to what we thought, A, was the party's position, or the party's position would be, and what we as individuals thought was the best course to take. And it's on that basis that some of us voted against the motion, some followed Mr. Coldwell in voting for it, and some preferred not to vote at all.
Well, in light of this rather complicated state of affairs, how is the average Canadian voter to determine just what is CCF policy on this? Is the Canadian voter to take Mr. Coldwell's viewpoint or to take your viewpoint?
Well, that too is, I admit, a difficult question until, shall I say, such time as there is another national convention of the party. Meantime, I think that the Canadian voter simply has to be aware of the facts, namely that the last convention of the party expressed itself against German rearmament in principle at that time. The National Council of the CCF in the light of the present situation, has expressed itself as against German rearmament, and a majority of us in the caucus expressed that same attitude when the vote was called.
Well, is this party convention likely to deal with Mr. Colwell as the
I'm awfully pleased that you've asked that question. I think that any national convention of the party would likely have the same attitude toward Mr. Colwell as we in our caucus had, and as we have expressed in our national executive. These are the only two bodies at the national level which have had an opportunity to meet since we had this honest difference of opinion on the floor of Parliament, and I'm free to say, I'm sure, that the day after the vote took place in Parliament, with a meeting of our caucus at which we unanimously endorsed Mr. Colwell's leadership, and a short while after that we had a meeting of the National Executive, a routine meeting that was called to deal with ordinary business, and at that meeting of the National Executive we unanimously endorsed Mr. Colwell as the leader of our party.
Well, how free, Mr. Knowles, is a member of the party to have an honest disagreement with his party on any such matter? Can a member decide on any issue that he will express a personal viewpoint?
Well, there is no law that says that a member can't. As a matter of fact, I feel inclined to ask you as my friends whether you're asking these questions to sort of prove the point that the CCF doesn't go in for regimentation, as some people try to make out sometimes, that we are a party in which, while we have a general philosophy and a general approach that we all take, we do respect the individual conscience and expect members to apply their own that come along.
Well, Mr. Knowles, what does that boil down to? You as a party member are free to repudiate your leader's stand, and the leader is free to repudiate your convention stand. Where do we go on that sort of a basis? How do we know what we're getting?
Well, as I have already indicated, it isn't quite correct. Even as one who felt that the convention's position was against German rearmament and would be if it were called again, even as one who felt very strongly, both as a CCF member and from my own views on the matter, that we should vote against German rearmament, I can't contend that there has been the kind of decision which means that Mr. Colwell has repudiated the party because he didn't go along with that decision. I know that you followed the debates on this matter, which were certainly debates of a very high order, and you would recognize that all who spoke in other parties as well as our own spoke from deep conviction about the matter, and that was our decision as a caucus, that on this issue perhaps the best thing we could do for the good of the movement, for the good of Parliament, for the good of Canada as a whole, was to bring to bear on the issue the best judgment that each of us could.
Well, Mr. Knowles, I wonder if I could deal with another matter of policy, namely defense. Mr. Pearson, Canada's External Affairs Minister, said recently that if ever there were a major war that involved the United States, that Canada is so closely linked that it would be drawn into it too. At least I think that's the substance of his statement. Would you agree with this position?
Well, I take it you're referring to the statement that Mr. Pearson made at the meeting of the Canadian Club in Toronto last Monday. I'd like to say about that statement of Mr. Pearson that perhaps it's good that he made it so that we now know where the Canadian government stands. There's been a certain amount of jockeying, shall I say, and playing with words, I think, on this position of the relationship between the United States and Canada in foreign policy. But we now have it from Mr. Pearson that in any conflict that's of major consequence, I realize he put in the qualifying phrase, where survival itself is at stake. If the United States is in a conflict, Canada is in it. As I say, we know now where the Canadian government stands vis-a-vis the United States in relation to foreign policy.
But where does the CCF stand?
But I don't like that stand. I still think, even though there may be certain realities that we have to face, I still think that Canada should maintain a certain amount of independence so far as foreign policy is concerned. I think we should make our own decisions. Now, I see you're trying to get in. There's just one more thought I'd like to express in connection with this matter. We know from statements he has made in public that Mr. Pearson time and again has made protests to Washington against certain lines of policy that the United States was following. I think he's probably gone so far as to tell the United States that under certain circumstances the United States would have to go it without Canada and perhaps go it alone. Well, Washington isn't going to pay any attention to statements like that anymore now that Mr. Pearson has said. If the United States is in a conflict of major proportions and all the United States has to do is decide that this is it, well, they know that we're going to come along. So our independence has been McRiver, can you put it that way?
Well, I wonder if I might just ask this question. As I understood Mr. Pearson's statement, it was that if a major war breaks, Canada is sure to be involved. It seems to me this statement was as much geographical as political, because a major war would involve a threat to the United States over her northern frontier, which is to say, over Canada. Do you in the CCF seriously suggest that this is not so?
No. I'm glad you asked that, if I didn't make it quite clear. Certainly if a major war broke out in the sense of a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. We're involved just as much as Belgium was involved
Isn't that
in
what
the
Mr. Pearson said?
First World War.
How could you have a major war without
I know
the Soviet Union?
I know that that's the interpretation that he is trying to place upon the remarks that he made last Monday, but I submit that Washington is entitled to take from Mr. Pearson's remarks the belief that Canadian foreign policy is simply to go along with the United States. And it's that denial of our independence of action or independence of decision in the field of foreign policy, which I think is very serious.
Couldn't you also take that to mean that since Canada is involved, she wants to have her voice in these matters that the United States may decide to settle unilaterally?
But if at the same time you're asking for your voice to be heard, you admit that in the last analysis you're going to go along with what the United States has decided, it doesn't leave much room for your voice to carry any weight. And I want to say quite frankly that I speak not merely critically of what Mr. Pearson said, I speak with some disappointment. I feel that the chance of his protest to Washington, for example, if the United States should decide to take action in respect of Quemoy or Matsu, if the chance of Mr. Pearson's protest to Mr. Dulles, his protest to Washington carrying much weight, has been greatly reduced.
Well, do you
by the
suggest?
kind of
Do
speech he made last Monday.
you really think, though, Mr. Knowles, that a major war in which the very existence of either country is at stake? Those were Mr. Pearson's words. Do you really think that any such war could be without the intervention of the Soviet Union? Do you think that China alone, unsupported by the Soviet Union, could threaten the very existence of Canada and the United States?
That's a good question. I don't think either you or I is in a position to answer it, but my point is that Mr. Dulles is entitled to make the opinion and make the judgment that that is the kind of war Mr. Pearson had in mind. Mr. Dulles is entitled to rely on Mr. Pearson coming along because of what he said last Monday, and I wish for Canada's sake Mr. Pearson hadn't made the statement.
Well, doesn't it work the other way? Presuming that Canada was invaded, wouldn't we be very happy to have the U.S. assistance?
Yes, and it's perfectly true that Mr. Pearson did put it that way. If it was a war for survival in which either was involved, the other would be involved. But there's this difference. We're not trying to defend Matsu or Quemoy. We're not likely to take the positive or affirmative actions that some of us are afraid the United States might take. In other words, we're not likely to take the kind of action that would endanger the United States, but I can see the possibility of Mr. Dulles' foreign policy resulting in an action that would endanger Canada.
Well, who's going to speak for the CCF in this matter? Yourself or Mr. Colwell?
Mr. Colwell and every member of the CCF have spoken with one voice on the question of the Far East. You may have been able to find an honest difference of opinion as to our attitude on German rearmament, but not one of you or any of your colleagues in the press gallery, and there are lots of them up there that would find the division if they could, can find any division so far as Formosa, the Far East is concerned. Mr. Campbell will do the speaking for us, but if anyone else were speaking, it would be the same position.
Well, Mr. Knowles, if I may shift the ground just a little bit, would you care to define CCF policy today with regard to the development of natural resources? Does the CCF still hold by socialization and nationalization?
The CCF has a basic position in regard to that. We believe that natural resources and the wealth of the country should be developed for the good of the country as a whole. We feel that there is room for private enterprise, certainly room for cooperative enterprise, and that there is a large sector that should and could best be developed under public enterprise. We're not the doctrinaire people that some of our critics make out that want to socialize everything for the sake of socializing it. We want to get the development done. And in our view, there are things that need to be done in Canada today. In fact, I think it's something that's happened within the last 2 or 3 days that simply aren't being done by private enterprise. I think of the fact, I don't know whether you fellows were in the press gallery this afternoon when I tried once again to get an answer out of the government about the Trans-Canada pipeline, and apparently nothing is being done. Why? Because this government won't build it under public ownership, and the private company is not prepared to go ahead with it unless they can get government backing of their bonds, and even apparently when they reach some sort of a tentative agreement with the government on a two-way proposition, the so-called producers, the big shops that own the fields out in Alberta, wouldn't agree to their doing anything because the government was involved. Now there you have an example of a development that's sorely needed in the country. We're not getting it under private enterprise, and this government is not prepared to go ahead with it under public enterprise. We think that's one of the types of things that should be done by the government.
Well, when you say the CCF no longer is a party of all-out socialization, are you...
Did I say no longer? Was it ever a doctrinaire party in the sense of all-out socialization?
Oh, I would rather interpret the Regina Manifesto as saying so. If I recall it right, it called for the nationalization of banks.
Well, let's waive the point in the interest of speed.
Yeah, I think we'll look it over when we get back to the building.
No, there's another topic I'd like to bring up here. Is labor generally better off in regards to working conditions under public ownership than under private ownership?
Not necessarily. In some instances, you could probably produce instances of the workers under public ownership not having it as good as they might have it under some private organization of a comparable kind, and vice versa. I think, generally speaking, the opportunities for the conditions of labor to be satisfactory are better under public ownership than under private ownership, but that isn't the only aspect of the situation that matters. It does matter, no doubt about that, but it's also important as to what benefit the country as a whole gets out of an enterprise. And it's for that reason, as well as for the good of the workers in a particular industry or particular enterprise, that we favor things being done on a public basis.
Well, to what degree would you eliminate competition by means of public ownership?
I don't think that competition would be greatly eliminated. There are some natural monopolies where it doesn't apply now. Any competition in the postal service at the present time. I think that in this pipeline business that I was talking about, that there's not room now for competition between pipelines running the length and breadth of this country. In other words, there are some areas of natural monopoly where competition has no function to play. There are other areas of the economy where, having admitted that there's a sector for private enterprise and a sector for cooperative enterprise, that there is room for competition.
What about oil? What about oil in Saskatchewan? Do you think that it ought to be developed by the province, or by a cooperative, or by private enterprise, or by all three? And if you say all three, would any private enterprise come in to do the prospecting?
Well, that is a pretty complicated question, isn't it? And I suppose that I've got to be careful what I say, lest you find that you're versed in what's actually happening in Saskatchewan, and you face me with that.
Just trying to find out what the CCF policy is, you know.
Insofar as possible, I would prefer that it be done under public enterprise. The difficulty at the provincial level is, of course, the available financial resources. Can a province risk the amount of money that is necessary to do the work connected with exploitation and of oil fields and bringing them into production? And because of that situation, a province seems to have, even a progressive province like Saskatchewan, seems to have no alternative but to make some arrangements as to leases and royalties and taxes, so that the development is done by a private enterprise, but that the greatest possible return from the oil wealth which belongs to the people comes back to the province. And as you know, to a considerable extent, there is development of oil in Saskatchewan under cooperative development with very real aid and encouragement from the government.
Aren't you, in effect, saying that at a certain stage in development of a country, private enterprise really is essential to get a job done, and you can't do without it?
I think that there's no denying the fact that in the history of the last 150 or 200 years, there's been a part that private enterprise played, and maybe that had to be played by private enterprise. In other words, I'm not suggesting that socialism is necessarily the system to start with at the year one, but the point does get reached where, for the best development of our resources and for the good of the country as a whole, and for bringing to the people of the country the benefits of the resources that we've got, a wide measure of public development, a wide measure of socialism does become of extreme importance.
Well, what you're saying is that private capital should be prepared to risk money where a socialist government won't.
Well, Norman, who's being doctrinaire now? Let's talk about private capital risking capital. You've been around Parliament for a while, and you know the constant requests that are made for relief from taxation and subsidies and assistance of all kinds to private capital. They don't want to risk anything at all. They want to have the name of employing risk capital and to get all the benefits that flow from nominally risking their capital, but they want to be protected in every possible way. The pipeline deal that's been around for the last little while. What did they want? They wanted it's a 300 and some odd million proposition, and they wanted 50 or 75 million of it to be equity capital that would get the gains, but they wanted the rest of it to be bonds that would be guaranteed by the government. And that's a pretty typical example today of this so-called risk capital.
Well, hasn't there been more money lost in developing oil than ever been made out of it?
Has there?
Well, you advanced that argument.
Maybe you've lost some in oil.
No, never. But
neither have I.
It seems to me you advanced that argument yourself, Mr. Knowles, that the Saskatchewan couldn't afford to take the risk.
They could over a long run, but you have the political difficulties there, the fact that you are using public money, and certain risks are run on a short term that might be rather difficult. But in the long run, you're not suggesting that private capital in oil or in any other field has really lost.
Would you like to comment on the relative merits of private and public enterprise in a more limited field, such as the box factory that was briefly run in Prince Albert by a CCF government, and the boot factory and the tanning factory and the salt factory, all of which I believe It's had a rather
Wouldn't you like to
inglorious
include
career.
the telephones and the bus lines and some of the other public enterprises in Saskatchewan
I know
that have been successful?
It is frequently preferred,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I just asked if you had any comment on those particular items.
I just suggest that this is common. On your side of the fence, you talk about the ones that...
I'm no side of this fence.
No, well...
I wonder if I could
just fine.
skip a few provinces east. Some of the members of your party, Mr. Knowles, have been interpreted as making remarks that are derogatory to the province of Quebec. Is this an indication that perhaps you've written Quebec off as future CCF territory?
I don't accept your premise, and therefore...
I said they were interpreted as being derogatory.
All right. Some people have misinterpreted statements that have been made by some of our members as being derogatory to one great section of our country, and so you asked the question based on that. I submit that there have not been statements of the kind that have been so misinterpreted, and that the CCF, despite the fact that we recognize we haven't a great deal of electoral strength in Quebec, haven't written it off. No national political party fails to recognize the importance in the Canadian political scene of the great province of Quebec.
Well, Mr. Knowles, what do you see as the real future of the CCF party in Canada? Do you see any possibility of it forming a
The
government?
future of the CCF party is the future of Canada, Mr. Needham. The hopes of Canada are tied up with the future of the CCF. It may take time, but we're all young fellows, and we'll live to see it.
Actually, although we're near the end of our time, we didn't intend to introduce a peroration at this point. Mr. Knowles. Could you, would you say if you agree with the recent statement of Premier Douglas of Saskatchewan that Canada should or is about to return to the two-party system?
I think that will come before long. Just how soon, I don't know. And it might be, and I think it would be a good idea. Most people say that they want the two-party system around, and I agree, but you know that I think that one of the two, of course, will be ours. That's inevitable in the nature of social development.
But has your party been stalled in the last little while, Mr. Knowles, because other parties have taken over some of their basic platforms?
We don't feel unhappy about the fact that we've been selling our ideas to the Canadian people so well that other parties have found it necessary to implement some of those ideas and then even take credit after they've done it for things that they opposed across the years. And I'm satisfied that, in other words, we're winning, I may say to you, we're winning already, and that we're getting some of our ideas established, and one of these days we'll have the chance to put them all into effect.
I think your second exit line is just as good as the first one. That came a little prematurely. Thank you very much, Mr. Knowles. We are out of time now. That's not just facetious. Thanks very much for coming down and answering all these questions. And thank you to Norman Campbell of the Toronto Telegram, that well-known socialist journal, and Bob Needham of the London Free Press, and Bob McKeown of Weekend Magazine. And so, ladies and gentlemen, until this time next week, it's good night from Ottawa.